Chapter 1. Run. They had to run. Zelda leaned back against Impa's muscular frame, gripping the horse's saddle, her hands slipping on the sweat coating her palms. She grasped the mane instead and hoped that she wasn't hurting Impa's loyal steed, Trust, who had been through countless trying adventures with Zelda's impervious attendant. The darkness of the castle town back alley through which they silently trotted pressed in on Zelda's eyes. She felt she could reach out and squeeze the darkness as though it were alive and had substance. A sentient being bent on suffocating her. But somehow the two fugitives cut through it, quiet silver swords slicing through soft butter. Fugitives. The Princess of Hyrule and her very own protector were now marked as such. The Gerudo King of Thieves occupying her castle had taken the throne in a sweeping genocide, murdering soldiers, staff, and most sorrowfully, the king, her father. He was gone, and now only Impa and Zelda remained. Impa having rescued her from the clutches of a wallmaster. Instead of fighting the overwhelming horde of monsters swarming the castle, Impa had scooped 10-year-old Zelda into her arms and ran for their lives. They only just made it to the stables and mounted Trust with the clothes on their backs and a few possessions. Impa had her kodachi and a canteen of water. Zelda had the Ocarina of Time, and that was it. Now, as the darkness threatened to choke her beyond revival, Zelda tried to focus on the brick and stone of the alleyway, the gray and red shadowed by the night, but still detectable. She wanted to reach out and drag her hand along the cold wall to her right, but she restrained herself, drawing on her royal training. She was hailed for displaying ultimate decorum on any given day, in any given situation, an honor her father had always appreciated. But sometimes a childish fever desired to break free of her cognition, to revel in the delight of rule-breaking. She commonly had to check herself when those fancies flashed in her mind. But why bother now? Why bother when so much had been destroyed? Her entire life had changed in an hour's time. Her father dead, the Hyrulean army crushed. Even her chambermaid had been wretchedly torn from the world with a jagged slash to the throat. Zelda had witnessed her slumped on the ground just outside of her bedroom, eyes frozen open and echoing the fear she must have felt as Impa clutched the princess and ran for freedom. Nothing would ever be the same, and neither would she. Was she even a princess anymore? Impa drew in a quick breath and tensed. Zelda turned her head slightly to see what had triggered her, but saw nothing.
"What is it?"
she whispered, but Impa shushed her. Impa reined Trust to a halt, gazing around her. Then Zelda heard it. A quiet step. It took merely a second for Impa to dismount and draw her weapon on the intruder, but they quickly realized that it was no enemy approaching them. A soldier. The only soldier Zelda had seen alive since the coup began. He had his hands raised in surrender, and Impa lowered her weapon. "Lady Impa, Your Highness. You're alive. Thank the golden goddesses."
"Captain,"
Impa addressed him, wasting no time.
"how many soldiers remain?"
"I do not know, my lady. I haven't seen another soul since we evacuated the townspeople. Many soldiers rerouted toward the castle, but I stayed behind in case there were stragglers."
Do not return to the castle.
Zelda interjected, unable to stop herself. Both the soldier and Impa looked up at her, and she suddenly felt uncomfortably vulnerable, sitting atop the horse without any weapon or ability to fight. Just a child, weak and aimless, shouting a feeble order, yet truly dependent on everyone else. She could not take care of herself, and the very idea of it frustrated her in that moment. But she allowed herself one last comment.
There's no one left alive.
Before the captain could reply, a faint noise sounded from behind them. Hoofbeats. "Go," the captain urged. "I'll hold them off." Impa did not hesitate. She stood tall and brought her fist to her chest in a military salute normally reserved for those who had passed in battle. This man still lived, but Zelda supposed it was clear that he would likely never see daylight again. A second later, Impa was again mounting trust. They bolted, the force whipping Zelda's head backward. She was thankful for Impa's strength and balance as she steadied the princess in the saddle, ensuring she wasn't to fall. Zelda's heart pounded in tandem with Trust's hoofbeats, sending shockwaves throughout her small frame. Who was after them? Was it another minion? Beings in iron armor shielding their faces now marched the halls of the castle and the gardens outside. Could one of them have noticed their escape? Zelda didn't know what kind of horse could carry a sentry like that, but with Ganondorf, anything was possible. The monsters that followed him were unlike anything she had witnessed, mutated, grotesque, murderous. They burst through the alleyway exit, and Impa guided Trust precariously around the still-running fountain fixed in the center of the square. Water gushed from a broken edge, flooding the stone tile, and Trust's hoofballs splashed it into Zelda's face. She wiped the moisture away, realizing only now that her cheeks had already been wet with fearful tears. When she opened her eyes, the Castletown gate loomed above them, but there were no guards posted there to open it. Impa reined in Trust and hopped down to wrench the chains that held the gate closed. All the while, the hoofbeats from behind them grew louder and louder. Zelda said a small prayer to the goddess for the brave captain. It took only seconds for Impa to lower the gateway, but it felt like an eternity. The sprawling view of Hyrule Field beckoned them, stars twinkling brightly in the sky, and a half-moon peeking just above the trees. Lon Lon Ranch stood proudly in the distance, soft lights flickering from windows. Zelda felt a sting of envy at the peace of the place. Impa mounted and spurred Trust on. It was in this moment, this small grouping of seconds during which they pounded across the gate that guarded a once bustling castletown, that Zelda felt time seem to slow to a crawl. A face, his face, peered up at her from left of the drawbridge, his bright blue eyes wide and questioning. Zelda drew in a deep breath, marveling at the timing. The fact that he was here, now, about to enter Castletown, perhaps to return to her with good news and the 3 spiritual stones. Elation blossomed within her chest.
Impa!
She shouted, but she was ignored. Whether Impa saw Link standing by or not, Zelda knew it was pointless to try and get her to stop. They couldn't stop. She knew that, but she had to do something. She made a snap decision. Reaching into her inner dress pocket, she retrieved that coveted magical item that Ganondorf was still missing. His attempt at conquering the castle was successful, but he hadn't stolen the spiritual stones, nor did he have the Ocarina of Time. And that was everything. He could do nothing else without these precious artifacts. But neither could Link. She clutched the ocarina to her chest and called on her light magic within. It was a magic she still didn't fully understand, and it was limited. But she could use its potential now. She would teach him the song through a telepathic message imbued within the instrument, meant only for him, only for the hero. Zelda opened her eyes, took a few deep, panicked breaths, and then threw the ocarina backward toward Link, summoning all of her strength. She saw his eyes track it through the air as it landed in the flowing waters surrounding the stone walls of Castletown. He had seen it. He must know that it was important, and she had to trust that he would dive after it and use it to open the door of time. As they galloped farther and farther away from the wide-eyed hero, Zelda felt her hope turn to helplessness. She had no idea where they would go, no clue how long they would be gone, and no sense of what was to come. And Link, he would be on his own now. But she would come back for him, no matter what it took. The crisp morning air bit into Zelda's cheek as she chewed the fish Impa had caught for their breakfast. Trust stood tied to a tree and munched his own meal, crunching on grass and flicking his ears. Lake Hylia was more vast than Zelda had ever surmised, and full to the brim with Hyrule's tastiest underwater sustenance. Fish never appealed to Zelda, but Impa had worked hard to grapple their food out of the water without a pull of any kind. So she pushed aside her stomach's protests and imbibed as best as she could. She was hungry after all. It had been a long night. They'd ridden for hours, reaching Lake Hylia, but persisting until they'd arrived at the farthest edge of the lake. From this vantage point, Zelda could see mountains in the distance topped with snowy white peaks. She hadn't a clue that anything existed beyond the boundaries of Hyrule, having only been tutored about the geography of the lands her father ruled, or had ruled. Tears threatened to surface again, but she fought them back and took another bite. Impa sat across from her, having finished her meal, and was now sharpening her blade against a rock. The sharp sound sliced through Zelda's very soul. Each biting slash brought forth shrieks from the dying, flashes of blood stains and viscera. It grated her, ate at her. Stop.
Stop!
Impa froze, her red eyes trained upon Zelda, who was now panicking, her breaths too quick, her heart pumping too hard.
Stop! Please stop!
The tears came then.
We didn't stop them from dying. Impa, we didn't save them. We didn't.
Impa was at her side, but Zelda didn't know when she'd arrived there. Her strong arms wrapped tightly around the princess as sobs overtook her body, convulsing her shoulders and limbs as though she were a useless doll. She was useless. She'd fought the feeling in front of the captain, who was surely dead now. But she could not fight it anymore. She was weak and helpless, so much so that even that same courageous captain who vowed to stay behind had told Impa of all people, to run. Impa the fighter, Impa the Sheikah, the trainer, the protector. The protector, above all else, Impa had dedicated her life to protecting the princess. It was true. But what if that vow had cost Hyrule the lives of its people? What if their abandonment of the castle resulted in the deaths of innocents? These thoughts spiraled themselves around Zelda's mind until her crying abated, exhaustion taking over. Impa hadn't said a word, simply embracing her and allowing her to break for a few moments. She would not judge Zelda's temporary lapse in decorum, whatever decorum existed within her anymore.
Listen to me,
Impa finally said softly, taking Zelda's face in her hands with gentle pressure. Zelda gazed into her fiery irises. Impa's eyes had always fascinated her. They seemed to contain fire and shadow, swirling together in a passionate dance.
None of this is your fault.
Zelda allowed her eyes to shut against the lie, but Impa shook her slightly.
Princess, none of this is your fault. It is the fault of that desert man. It's the fault of the evil that drenches his soul. You aren't responsible for his evil, nor his actions.
Zelda frowned.
But if we had stayed, what if you could have helped?
She refused to believe that they had made the right choice.
And if I had, what do you think would have happened to me? To you, as a result? Most of our army had been decimated by the time I got to you. The castle was overrun. I can fight 10 enemies at once on a good day, but against hundreds, I'm as useless as a Deku.
That gave Zelda pause. Of course, Impa couldn't fight a horde of hundreds of monsters. She didn't know anyone who could. Was it just wishful thinking that they could have made a dent at all? Perhaps Impa was right. It did help the guilt a small bit. Impa released Zelda's face and stood. She looked out across the lake, and then back toward those snowy mountains.
I'm taking you somewhere safe. An ancient place where we'll find friendly faces. Are there villages outside of Hyrule? There is much outside of Hyrule. Endless farmlands, villages, cities, forests.
The mention of forests brought Link sharply back into Zelda's tired mind. She prayed that he was all right, that he had gone straight to the Temple of Time and done what he had to do. If he'd played it just right, he could have eluded whatever enemies were after them. But she had no way of knowing. The despair was drowning her.
That boy is resourceful,
Impa said with a half-smirk. She was so good at knowing what Zelda was thinking. Sometimes terrifyingly so.
I don't think he's within reach of the King of Thieves.
She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. But now Impa was going to take her somewhere far away. It had to be far if it was safe. That thought scared her more than anything, because what if they never returned? Chapter 2. To Safety. Much of the ride toward the mountains stretched across flat, shapeless lands extending across the east and west. But southward, those snowy mountains loomed large and intimidating. Impa had said they were headed to a Sheikah village called Kageno. Impa was born and raised in Kakariko, the Sheikah village within Hyrule's borders, and the only one of which Zelda had been aware. Kageno was apparently larger and more bustling, its Sheikah residents having lived there for a century. Zelda had only ever met one Sheikah, Impa herself, but her knowledge of their culture was quite broad, considering how excellent a teacher Impa was. Zelda knew that the Sheikah as a whole had been loyalists to the royal family for countless years until something changed. Historical texts were vague regarding what that change was, but Impa had always suspected a betrayal. The Sheikah were banished, and many executed during Hyrule's civil war. Despite this, Impa had proven herself worthy of the royal family's trust. So completely, in fact, she was appointed Zelda's attendant shortly after the princess's birth. Despite the long-waged war and shadowy suspicions about her people, Impa had pledged herself to the king, who in turn granted her much freedom. She'd been able to secure Kakariko as a safe space for the underprivileged and displaced in Hyrule, establishing herself as a hero in her own right. Other Sheikah souls had not been so lucky. Even Zelda's father still held some animosity towards them. But Impa had never once questioned him or his beliefs. The older Zelda became, the more she understood the gravity of it all. Zelda knew she'd be protected beyond a doubt with Impa, and if Impa thought Kageno was the right move, then the princess would follow. They stopped for one last break before the final stretch to the Sheikah village, and Zelda's legs screamed and protested as she dismounted. These long days of laborious riding had made her sore and chafed, despite her being an exceptional rider. She collapsed against a tree and sighed, stretching each leg cautiously. She marveled at her soiled dress that was unrecognizable as a royal garment anymore. If she was still a princess, she certainly didn't look the part. Impa wasn't fazed by the hard riding, of course. She paced for a few minutes, deep in thought about something. Zelda knew better than to ask. She closed her eyes, just to rest them just for a few minutes. She hadn't slept in days, not really. How could she possibly with the constant, undulating pounding of horse hooves? And Impa would only allow enough time for eating when they broke for rest. 2 straight days of riding. She would just rest her eyes. The castle seemed to shimmer with purplish magic, a cloudy ring of darkness surrounding the peak. Thunder rumbled and lightning crackled, a malevolent storm brewing within the newfound evil that now overtook Hyrule. The world had changed. No one bustled through Castletown nor hiked the paths of Hyrule Field, and why would they? Terror seemed to thrive in the emptiness. Only Zelda stood upon the stone ground, utterly alone. She needed to find him, the boy in green. She needed to tell him what to do. She turned toward the Temple of Time, also shrouded in stormy darkness, seemingly existing in an untouchable void. But she marched towards it anyway. She had to get to him. The impossibly tall doors of the temple stood wide open. The vast central room inundated with a fog that settled near the floor. Each step she took chased the fog into manic spirals around her feet. Was the temple empty as well? Had everyone in Hyrule just disappeared? Then the sweet, low notes of the Song of Time drifted in her ears. Notes from an ocarina. She saw him, a shadowy green form swaying side to side with the music, and there, 3 distinct lights, green, red, and blue, shining on the altar in front of him, sparkling with hope. He had done it. She watched as the door of time rumbled open, vibrating the floor beneath her feet, watched as he sprinted inside towards a smaller pedestal, one cradling that legendary blade. Her prayers had been answered, her dreams realized. With the blade of Evil's Bane, the Desert King could be conquered. The Triforce would grant their wish of hope and freedom, and all would be well again. But as he pulled the sword free, something strange happened. A blue column of light enveloped him, closed in on him, and the boy in green vanished. Zelda's confusion racked her. Where had he gone? The sacred realm was indeed a place separate from their own, but she thought perhaps the Triforce would simply reveal itself and offer its magic to Link. She hadn't thought he'd be taken somewhere. She tried to move forward, but she felt frozen, stuck. Her legs would not budge, and a sinister laughter invaded the empty space behind her, followed by a familiar dark voice. "You have led me to the gates of the sacred realm. Yes, I owe it all to you, kid." The desert man strode confidently towards the still shimmering column of light, entered into it, and Zelda's world went black. Like being sucked into a vortex, Zelda felt herself forced back into reality, and as her eyes fluttered open, she realized the magnitude of her dream, the detail, the lucidity. It hadn't been a dream at all. Impa now sat opposite her, her arms crossed and peering at Zelda.
What did you see?
Whether Zelda had been obviously thrashing around in her sleep, or Impa simply intuited that she'd had a vision, her guardian knew. Impa was the only person who believed the princess when the visions first began, after all. She still remembered the night she had her first one. It felt different from a dream because she not only saw images, but she felt things. And she felt things now.
Link. He made it to the Master Sword,
she replied, a tear falling down her cheek.
But Ganondorf, he followed him into the sacred realm.
Zelda shook her head in utter confusion.
I don't understand how. How did he know what we were planning?
Impa took a moment to consider.
The desert man is cunning. We were aware of this. Perhaps he knew more than we suspected from the very beginning.
A sense of despair threatened to overtake Zelda. Now that Link had made it to the sacred realm, what would happen to him? Would Ganondorf reach the Triforce before Link? Would they have to fight each other in that sacred place? Was that even possible? The sacred realm was a realm of light. Its existence well known, at least by the royal family, but few had actually made it there, which meant their knowledge was limited. Zelda wasn't sure what the rules of the place might be, or if they could be bent. Obviously, anyone could enter it, no matter their intention. The Triforce itself was known to be an unbiased artifact that would grant the wish of whoever made the arduous journey to use it. The only truth that gave her any hope was that whoever wished upon it must have a balanced heart, a soul unblemished. Hardly anyone existed who could fit that mold, especially not Ganondorf. But still, he made it inside, followed Link, his intentions clear, and there was nothing she could do. Zelda closed her eyes in defeat. She would never forgive herself for sending Link on this mission if he met a torturous end at Ganondorf's hand.
We will have to be patient.
Impa interrupted Zelda's self-destructing thoughts.
Until we know more, we must have hope.
Zelda sighed in response. She said a silent prayer to the goddesses, begging for more visions, more answers. They needed answers. The Hebra Mountains. That was what Impa called them. The temperature dropped significantly once they neared the base of the giant, rocky behemoths. Zelda felt incredibly small in comparison, an insect in the face of natural strength. She swallowed nervously as Trust trotted towards the spiraling village nestled right at the base of one of the mountains. It sat on a hillside, shadowed and protected. Impa halted Trust and twisted around to look at Zelda.
Put this on.
She handed Zelda an off-white sash.
Around your face, to hide yourself.
Though they were fugitives from Hyrule only, Zelda knew they must remain cautious wherever they ended up. She did as she was told. They were waved in by 2 guards standing by at a large red gate, which was swung open for them, revealing the bulk of the town. Kakariko was a simple village, the decor bland, the buildings beige, and the roofs a faded red. But Kageno had much more gusto in the way of design. Bright red and green toggles adorned the doors of houses and shops alike, lined with Sheikah script that Zelda could not read. Many people had the same silvery white hair and red eyes, just like Impa. Zelda knew her attendant would be happy to come back to her roots, though she wouldn't make the feelings obvious. Impa slowed Trust to a stop at the nearest stable not too far from the entrance. A stable hand, a girl about Zelda's age with bright eyes and a lot of energy, sprinted up to them to grasp Trust's reins and bowed away, pulling the exhausted horse along. Zelda hoped they would take good care of the steed, but Impa didn't seem concerned. Impa led her through the streets of Kageno, nodding at the strangers as they passed. Zelda wasn't sure if Impa knew them all personally, but she was grateful that no one stopped them or questioned their visit. Most of the people were Sheikah, but there were some Hylians as well, and she spotted one buying colorful gems from a shop filled with the most stunning jewelry she'd ever seen. As a royal princess, she'd been witness to outlandishly beautiful jewels, hailing from all parts of Hyrule, but these sparkled in such a way as to stop her in her tracks. Impa had to redirect her attention to get her moving again. The bustling Kageno was not what Zelda expected at all, and she began to feel a small spark inside her, one that reassured her, made her feel as though perhaps not everything was dark and dangerous. They'd run to safety, and it seemed they had found it. But still, she pulled the sash close around her face. Finally, they halted in front of a large inn, the sign, with faded Sheikah script, featuring a bed. As they went to step inside the building, Zelda heard a wagon rattling behind them, and she looked to see an older woman at the reins and a small Hylian boy next to her holding a large pumpkin in his lap. He looked happy and proud of his quarry, which made Zelda want to giggle. Before the door shut behind them, Zelda saw the boy glance her way, and their eyes met for a brief moment, both of them grinning like silly children. Of course, she was a child, and her face was covered, but she couldn't help feeling her cheeks heat at the boy seeing her in such a raw state. She smoothed the front of her destroyed dress and stood a little taller.
Decorum,
she thought.
Impa!
A gravelly female voice declared, startling Zelda out of her embarrassed state.
Telma, good to see you.
Impa replied with a genial smile. The woman rustled her skirts through a small opening behind the front desk of the inn and barreled over to Impa, crushing her in a bear hug. She was a pleasantly plump woman, though her dress was more low-cut than Zelda was used to seeing.
It's been too long. What do we owe the...
She began, but then noticed Zelda standing there, her hands awkwardly clasped in front of her. She had been trying to look invisible, but the boisterous Telma didn't seem like a lady who missed much.
And who is this?
She asked with inquisitive eyes. Zelda smiled at her despite herself. She'd always been drawn to strong, confident women like Impa and Telma, those who presented themselves with a sense of purpose. And sometimes that did not mean decorum. Impa took a moment to answer, lowering her voice when she did.
Telma, we need a room before I can fill you in.
She gave Telma a pointed look.
I see. Well, you've come at the right time of year. Barely any tourists. I'm going to give you our best suite. It overlooks the mountainscape and the Hebrew waterfalls. Just beautiful this season.
She rustled around the desk, searching for a room key, before beckoning for them to follow her down a long, wooden-planked hallway. It smelled musky, as though a woman wearing a fancy perfume had just strode through it. She led them up a flight of stairs and down another hallway, halting at the very end and unlocking an ancient-looking door.
Here we are,
she exclaimed, waving her hand in a dramatic, sweeping fashion. Zelda balked at the suite. Telma had made it seem like it would be majestic and royal, but all Zelda could see was faded and chipping paint on 4 walls, 2 small rickety beds sporting holes in the blankets, and a tiny table with a vase of dead flowers. The only pleasant feature, a small fireplace near the window. Telma yelped, rushing over to the table and snatching the vase.
These aren't supposed to be here. So sorry about that. Do settle in, and Impa, let me know when you're ready to chat. You know where to find me.
She smiled in genuine joy as she left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Impa glanced down at Zelda, who was trying her best to look completely satisfied with their lodging situation.
I know it's not what you're used to,
she said with a smile,
but it will have to do for now.
Zelda nodded, obeisance taking over.
It's wonderful,
she lied, but then she looked out the window and saw that Telma's description of the mountainscape and waterfalls was much more accurate than that of the room. There were so many more mountains than Zelda had realized. Layers and layers of them, miles of rocky giants as far as she could see, and in a valley dozens of feet below the inn, which she now realized nestled atop a frighteningly tall cliffside, she could see the rushing waterfalls. The water sparkled and foamed from 5, she counted, each one spilling into a deep water hole at the very bottom of the valley. There were trees down there too, many of them showing the first signs of autumn, their leaves shifting into golds and yellows, creating an array of color that rivaled the gems from the jewelry shop. But something about it made her heart race a little too fast, as though something didn't want her there. Impa came up behind her and let out a sigh. Zelda looked up at her to see what sort of sigh it was, and she saw her attendant's face was grave. Impa took Zelda's hand in hers and led her to sit at the tiny table.
Impa? Zelda, we need to talk about what our story will be. Our story? We know our story. Yes, we do. But not everyone should be privy to it, especially those we have never met, and therefore cannot trust. Don't you know people here? You know Telma. Telma is an old friend, yes. But I don't know everyone. And the world being what it is now, we can't be sure there are not spies in every crevice. I don't know what Ganondorf would be willing to do in order to complete his mission. He may have entered the Sacred Realm, may have even gotten to the Triforce, but he didn't get everything he wanted.
Zelda wanted to question what she meant, but it took her merely a few seconds to realize it. Part of his mission was to wipe out the royal family, but the princess got away.
I'm going to tell Telma the truth. We can trust her, and we'll need an ally here. But everyone else, we must treat them as a threat. We cannot reveal who we are to anyone. Do you understand?
She nodded, her eyes wide but tired. She was so tired. Impa nodded back and released her hands.
Get some sleep, princess. You're safe right now.
Right now? What about later? Next time on Path of Shadow. The Princess of Hyrule would swallow her pride for countless reasons. But this?
You must become someone else. Someone who exists as far away from a princess as possible.
So it seemed she would have to change. The risk was great. But Impa said she couldn't stay locked inside the inn forever. Her eyes widened at the sight. She didn't recognize herself.
Ah, our new student has arrived.
Professor Robbie, this is Sheik. Sheik, your new instructor.
And she, of course, had just removed her face and head wraps. Too early, too impatiently, revealing every inch of her royal face to the wagon boy's wide, knowing eyes.